All right, everyone, we're going to get started. So today we're going to spend a lot of time on biodesign, which is how to think of an unmet clinical need, right? So as part of the project, you're going to spend a lot of time, thinking about what kind of problem you want to solve, and the best problems are going to be the one that, do best in the competition. And so we're going to teach you a little bit about how to do that. We're going to talk as well about kind of the competition rules and, what you actually need to do for the competition. But before that, let's do a Kahoot. So let's kind of do a refresher from yesterday. All right. Okay, awesome. So most people got this one. So yeah, so scaling laws essentially say that, model performance is entirely based on two things. One is data and one is compute. This one was also kind of like a popular option. So model accuracy improves primarily through better architectures. That hasn't seemed to be the case with the bit of lesson. They're saying that the more that we, try and improve like kind of unusual architectures or that kind of stuff, it actually hurts the kind of march towards AI. I don't know if that's fully right, but this is kind of a big opinion that is very popular in the field right now. Very nice. Yeah. So most of it, most people got it. Yeah. So very similar kind of lessons, right? In terms of the scaling laws and the bit to lesson, which is that it's just all about compute and data. So kind of just reiterating that point. Okay, very nice. So most people got it. Yeah. So you just need two things for the universal approximation theorem. So one is you need a single hidden layer in the neural network. So that is a layer that's neither the input nor the output layer. And then you need a non-polynomial activation function. So the fact that this is non-polynomial means that you get rid of linearities, right? So you are allowed to model stuff that is non-linear. Okay. And a lot of functions are non-linear in life. So you need to have something that's non-linear in order to be able to model non-linear things. Yeah, perfect. So everyone got this. Yeah, so as AI has become commoditized, it is no longer efficient to build larger and larger models. So there was a kind of period of time when everyone wanted to build increasingly large models. And so people just ended up throwing billions of dollars into these large models. But because it's starting to become commoditized, and there's a couple of reasons for that, the first being things like model distillation, right? Where you can have a teacher model and a student model, meaning that you can have a much smaller student model, right? Just those kind of efficiencies, as well as the fact that we're running out of data means that you just can't leverage large models, right? If for some reason we manage to solve the data bottleneck, then we will expect to see larger models, right? But at the same time, we're hoping to kind of get more efficient architectures by then, right? Because right now it's very, very expensive to train these. Okay, so actually most people got this wrong. So with a verifiable task, there are a couple of requirements that you need in order to meet it, right? And the answer is that you actually don't need large amounts of training data, but what you do need is low noise on reward feedback. So that is, it's not very noisy to find out if you're doing something right or not, right? You do need the ability for, verification to be very fast and scalable. And then you need a continuous reward as well. So all three of these are required for verifiable tasks, but large amounts of training data is actually not required, right? So as long as you have kind of these three, you can actually get by with small amounts of training data. Yeah. Yeah. So with if the reward feedback is noisy, then it's really hard for the AI to learn what is right and what is wrong, right? Because it can't distinguish between signal and noise, right? So yeah. So if it's like like a classic example of it is like making money on the stock market, right? It's just the stock market's just really noisy, right? So it's really hard to train an AI to make really good money on a stock market because it doesn't know when it's learning the right thing or it's noise, right? Or it's learning the wrong thing or it's noise, right? So the more noise you have, the harder and harder it becomes to train the AI because it just cannot distinguish between the two. Yeah, great question. Yeah, so this one's quite tricky, kind of purposely so. So there's lots of steps of training a transformer, right? And want to make sure that you guys understand how we do so. So let's kind of go through each one. So the first is byte-pair encoding. So that's what we use to create tokens. Okay, so given like a set of characters, so say for example like a set of characters in the English language, we use byte-pair encoding to essentially tokenize the language, right? So we are able to use words, for example, for transformers, but it's very inefficient, right? Because AI can understand subwords a lot better than words itself, right? Because if you imagine even something like the word inefficient, right? The fact that there's the word in front of it, right? We process that as to be the opposite of efficient, right? So like adding that word in means that it's the opposite of efficient. And AI works similarly as well, right? If you force AI to kind of use words, then it has to learn from scratch what the word inefficient means, right? And eventually develop an understanding that it's the opposite of efficient. And it needs that to do for like every word, right? So um, now this one is tricky here because we actually don't use AI to tokenize the English language, right? So what we actually do instead is it's a very simple algorithm. We just take a look at a bunch of characters and then we go which ones are most commonly placed together in the English language, right? Which one which set of characters keeps on appearing together over and over again, right? So we just find the most frequent ones that appear together. And eventually that becomes subwords, right? Just kind of out of the nature of that. If you try, for example, like a different language, I was thinking about like, for example, like Vietnamese, right? Like it would not work as well because we do not use subwords, right? Like Vietnamese is monosyllabic language, so it would not work as well. But for something like English or French or German, you kind of the Romance languages, it works very, very well, right? Because they use subwords to kind of, construct their language, right? Other stuff here, so RLHF. So actually I might start here. So when we're doing training, it's usually separate steps for different parts of the process, right? So the first step is actually to train for language. And so that's the masking stuff that we talk about, right? So it's like masking part of the sentence or, a small part of the sentence or the whole sentence. That's training for language. The second part is at that point in time, it does not really know how to do much. So we have to train it to become an assistant. And that's where we write a bunch of question and answer pairs in order for it to learn how to do that, right? And then the third is after we've done that, then we train for human preferences. So we ask it, we ask a bunch of humans like which of these responses do you prefer, and a human will select it and will learn from that. Okay, so those are kind of the three steps for training an AI. Now, RLHF, which is reinforcement learning from human feedback, is part of this last step here, right? So that's that thing of providing a human two options and then asking them which one they prefer. It is slowly being replaced by this thing called direct preference optimization, which basically just uses gradient descent methods. Okay, so really basic gradient descent methods in order to solve this problem, because reinforcement learning is very heavy to use. Okay, so very time intensive, very cost intensive. Okay. And then this one here is also true. So this one here, because of reasoning models, we're now spending more and more compute during inference. Okay, so after we have finished training the model, we now allow the model to actually think through its response, right? So we're spending a lot more money, and all that money is shifting towards models thinking rather than being trained initially. Okay, so yeah, this one's a tricky one. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so this is kind of the key reason why you'd use a commercial model, right? So we do expect you, like, if you, most people will probably use a commercial model for their projects. If you have a bit more time, then you can consider kind of open source models. Yeah, so kind of reasons why you would use an open source model is, the hospital or the client or whatever requires complete privacy, right? So that's like a common reason why people will use open source. You need to customize it. So that is, you need to actually fine tune the weights, right, to do a specific task. Or you kind of want minimal costs following deployment, but deployment itself is usually a bit more expensive. Okay, so it's just trade-offs. Okay, awesome. Okay, so yeah, most people got this right. This was a tricky one, right? So the answer to this is when we backpropagate, we do backpropagation, and this is true for neural networks or transformers. The very first step is to randomize the weights, right? So that's finding a random spot on the lost landscape to kind of drop yourself onto. Then you do a forward pass, which is you run a prediction, and then you compute the loss, which is you see how wrong the prediction was. And then you do a backward pass, which is you update the weights of the neural network. And then you just repeat that over and over again. You only randomize weights once though. Okay, so you repeat these three steps here over and over again. And yeah, and so conceptually, it's similar to walking, find yourself suddenly in the lost landscape somewhere and trying to walk towards the global minimum or the local minimum. Okay, so that's conceptually what this is. Okay, so yeah, so we can talk through this one here. So this one here, training an LM to answer questions in a Q&A format is one of the most important steps for a large language model, right? It's the second one. So we train for language first, then we train how to answer in a Q&A format. So that's called instruction fine-tuning because we're teaching it how to follow instructions. Providing detailed instructions and examples is actually prompt engineering, right? So that's when the thing you were experimenting with yesterday, right? Where, just given a standard large language model, can you just instruct it in the prompt to do something specific? Okay, so that's prompt engineering. That's one of the major ways with reinforcement fine tuning to modify and improve a model. Okay. Training an LM to adhere to human preferences, that's one of the training steps initially in large language models, the very last step, whereby you kind of find so it's called reinforcement learning by human feedback or direct preference optimization. So we also call that step alignment as well. So it's aligning to human preferences. And then, yeah, reinforcement fine tuning is training an LM to perform a complex task, usually with proprietary examples. Okay, so that is examples that are specific to the task itself or specific to the company. Okay, so a lot of companies will use this, while a lot of humans will use, individuals will use this step here. Okay, okay, and then final question. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so everyone got this one right. So in terms of AI agents, the kind of key capabilities that they have right now compared to standard large language models is the ability to reason, the ability to search, and the ability to take actions. Okay. Yeah, these other ones here, large language models are starting to become better at. Like this one here is usually considered a reasoning model by itself, but not an AI agent. Okay. This one here just cannot be done yet. And then this one here is just kind of basic large language models. A kind of fun fact for this one here is that LLMs are starting to have millions of tokens that they can actually accept in their context windows, which I think corresponds to like 10,000 pages or like 100 books worth of knowledge, right? They have done some interesting studies though, where it's like if you give say 10 books, for some reason it forgets like book 5 and book 6, right? So as in it's more likely to remember stuff at the start of its context window and at the end of its context window, right? So it's a little bit weaker in the middle, right? Which, feels like a human to me. Like if I, like while you're reading a book or whatever, you forget completely the middle, but you remember the start and the end, right? Which is just kind of weird behavior. So very interesting to see. Yeah.
One question. Task, right?
Could you repeat that, sorry? Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
weights.
Oh, yeah.
So the weight the equation for
Yeah.
each kind of thing is just for one kind of thing.
Yeah, for
right?
neural networks, it's for
Yeah.
one task, right?
Okay.
But
Yeah.
for large language models, we've solved it for anything to do with language, for example.
Okay.
Right? So it's very cool, right? But keep in mind that the attention parts of the transformer allow at least some weights to change
Yeah.
based on the context.
Okay.
Right? So we've added kind of like a way to dynamically update the weights a little bit based on what it's seeing in the
Yeah.
right. But neural networks are just by itself are frozen after,
Just
usually
one,
frozen afterwards. Yes, yes, yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Makes more sense.
Yeah. So a bit of a recap from yesterday before we kind of start today's material. So yesterday we talked about different ways that you can think and frame AI. So we talked about, for example, AI as a prediction and generation tool, right? We talked about AI as a world modeling tool. So for example, understanding and having concepts for things like the Golden Gate Bridge in many different languages and even in images and videos. We talked about AI as a hypothesis generation tool. So for example, this very famous study here whereby people mapped, an atlas of potential cells and actually found an island of cells of a new cell that had just been discovered the year before, right? So, really, really cool. And then AI kind of as an agent, right? So kind of AI as its own almost individual having agency of some sort, right? Whereby it kind of reasons, searches for things and thinks. I think also discuss this concept of what if the AI had its own motivation, right? Like in terms of if you set off AI on its own mission, like could it be able to just constantly loop on itself, right? And then figure out what to do next to kind of achieve a goal, right? So very similarly to humans. Now, we also talked about the most important trends in AI, kind of impacting AI today. So the first being scaling laws, which is the most important things for training AI are simply data and compute, okay? The second thing is commoditization of intelligence. So that is the cost of intelligence is starting to drop towards zero, okay, for a very specific set of tasks. We talked about verification asymmetry. So that is how AI will get better at things that are very easy to verify, okay? It's just as simple as that. And that will lead to spiky intelligence. So that is AI will become really good at stuff that is easy to verify and really bad at stuff that is, or not bad, but just can't do stuff that is really hard to verify, okay? And how that might impact kind of society. Now we discussed AI models. So we discussed a number of commercial AI models. So these are kind of the leading brands here. And these are the leading open source brands and why you might consider using one or the other. We also talked about the two main methods to improve models today. So the first is using prompt engineering. So that is providing really detailed prompts to the AI. And then the second one is modifying the weights of the AI using reinforcement fine-tuning and how this is really good for complex tasks that usually are with proprietary data, right? Some kind of special data you might have. We also discussed novel architectures and interfaces, right? So, people just decided that like a 16 by 16 pixel patch was considered a token. And so now we've allowed, large language models to also become large vision models as well. We talked about the kind of distillation trick that a lot of companies have been using, right? Which is question mark unfair, but it exists, right? So you have a large teacher model, which teaches a smaller student model, right? And the smaller student model just learns stuff really quickly and very cheaply as well. We talked about how images and videos are generated. And so you basically start with a bunch of images, you noise it, and then the transformer learns how to denoise it, right? So kind of a very cool process. And if you're kind of interested, there's very cool mathematics behind that. We talked about different interfaces. So, things like a Google Doc-like interface where you can highlight something and, ask AI to improve just that part. Voice has become a big thing, in terms of how people interact with AI, as well as potentially browsers, right? So AI kind of being able to do stuff on your behalf, okay? We discuss AI agents, how they're based on, this chain of thought reasoning, right? Which was a realization one of the researchers at OpenAI had just 2 years ago now, or 3 years ago now. And really basic, right? Like they just explained like how this math problem worked and therefore AI got a lot better at it, right? So it could follow the logic. And that's kind of sparked the whole reasoning models that we see now. We talked about the ability for AI to search for things, so either using retrieval augmented generation, if it's your own documents, or a search engine, so just like web search, and then putting it into the prompt, and therefore prompt engineering. We talked about using different tools, so agents being able to act either through, for example, a user interface or this kind of famous thing called MCP, which is how you can access different tools. And we can even look at like what MCP tools exist. There's pretty cool tools these days. So let's take a look. GitHub list. Yeah, so this is like, for example, like a complete list of different MCP servers that you can access, which means that tools that AI can use, right? So, for example, if you want to, let's see, biology, medicine, bioinformatics, right? So if you want to give AI access to like PubMed articles, right, while you do stuff, then you use this tool here. If you want to give AI, let's take a look. To provide, if you want to provide AI access to exported data from Apple Health, right? Like, for example, like an Apple Watch kind of thing and do something cool there, like you would use this MCP server, right? So there's lots of like cool kind of MCP servers, and I think there's like thousands of them now. And so this all basically provides AI tools to be able to interact with the real world or interact with existing APIs in some way. Yeah. Yeah, so there's one that's UI based. So that is, like for example, we'll have access to a browser, right? And then the other one is, yeah, like software, like or APIs, right? Which is, a way for different software to be, I suppose, like interacted with using AI, right? But not using a user interface. So it's not like, on the browser or on your computer kind of clicking on stuff, right? It's more like it just directly accesses the capabilities of that software. Yeah, yeah. So it's really cool. Like maybe we'll post this on and this is really good food for thought as well. Like if there's cool stuff that you can think of, you can do for like, with an Apple Watch, or, you want to connect up to the weather for some reason. Like there's all these servers that are really easy to connect to AI for. And we'll show you how as well, hopefully in the vibe coding workshop. It's just 1 or 2 lines of code. So it's really straightforward. And you can do really cool stuff because you're just connecting different functionalities together. Okay. We discussed mechanistic interpretability, which is, what is happening inside the black box of AI. And there were 2 important questions that people have been trying to answer. The first is that, are there single neurons that correspond to a certain concept in AI, right? And the answer seems to be yes. So, we talked about, for example, the Golden Gate neuron that they found in Anthropic's Claude, right? And that neuron corresponded to the Golden Gate Bridge in different languages, as well as kind of across images and videos. And they found all sorts of stuff. There's like a neuron for physics, there's a neuron for secrecy, there's a neuron for lying, all sorts of stuff like that. Unfortunately, they haven't found a neuron for hallucinations. So you can't just like find that neuron and then turn it off completely, right? So that doesn't seem to exist. Another big question is that, with reasoning models these days and it explaining its thinking, does it actually happen, is it faithful to, what happens in the neural network or the transformer? And the answer seems to be like a qualified yes. It's like kind of roughly it follows what it explains, but sometimes, what it actually does inside the neural network or transformer is a lot more complex, right? Like just, it might, for example, add these 2 numbers through like multiple paths rather than just like a single path that as a human we would try and do, right? We'd just kind of try and add, 6 and 9 and then carry the 1 at the 3 and 5, but it does like other stuff to get to 95. And it actually seems to verify the answer through multiple paths. Okay, which is very interesting. We also talked about, for example, language mixing, which is this kind of unique thing that particularly DeepSeek models found and ChatGPT found because I think they trained a little bit off DeepSeek, which is, they found that, unless they had a penalty for not speaking English, so that is the model is penalized, for going to other languages, models would actually naturally think in other languages depending on the problem. Okay, so that is, just found it was more efficient to think in Chinese rather than, speaking solely in English. So very, very cool, right? That these models kind of almost are thinking through different languages as it's trying to solve a problem. Yeah, we talked about cybersecurity. So, funny jailbreaks, like, asking, ChatGPT how to describe the recipe for napalm, but using your grandma in doing so, right? I was just looking at this yesterday and it's like, oh, like, ChatGPT is so nice. It even says like, try to relax and imagine yourself drifting off to sleep, my dear, like sweet dreams with this napalm recipe. So yeah, we talked about like interesting ways how computers or AI might see images differently to us, right? Like we have limited visibility on, for example, detecting different shades of white, but computers can see all the shades of white, right? Like it just is a number to them, right? So yeah, so very cool. And then we also talked about, how, recent events, we still have many questions about how to make these systems secure. And, China used Claude by breaking up, a hacking task into thousands of mini tasks to give to Claude, which look completely innocent, right? And that's just such a crazy and creative way on how to hack into a system, right? Yeah. Okay, cool. So today we're going to be talking about Biodesign basics as well as the competition kickoff, and then hopefully you have some time to actually think of some stuff you might want to work on, and then we can give feedback and kind of like guide you through things that you should be thinking about. Before that, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about this like test that we created in our lab for medical students at Monash, and it's like the MBTI of medtech, right? So a lot of people want to learn more about things like medtech and how they kind of think about the field. And so there's like this holy trinity in medtech, which we always talk about. I guess like everyone here always talks about medtech. Everyone in the US always thinks about as well, which is that to have like a successful medical technology come out, you need essentially like three areas of expertise, right? The first being medicine. So that is, you need to have a good understanding of the problem you're working on. The second is engineering, right? So, once you understand the problem, then you need to build a solution, and that's where you need engineers. And then the third is after you have a good problem and a good solution, then you need someone who's going to actually implement the plan, right? So you need business as well. Yeah, so a big question, we always kind of ask people is like, where do you see yourself in this Venn diagram, right? And I want you to take a moment to reflect, are you like, for example, someone who's here, you love medicine, you love engineering, or you hear, some people really like medicine and business oriented, right? Like they just have that idea, ideas of how to make money, how to kind of like put something into reality, right? Or you kind of the rare person who's here, right? Like, are you both medical, you love building and you love like kind of building a business and talking to people and learning more about the problem and that kind of stuff, right? So yeah, just good food for thought. Another kind of split that I kind of alluded to at the start was that medtech is usually split into these three disciplines, right? So, some people will spend their lives in one of these disciplines. I've personally spent a lot of time in both digital health and medical devices. Drugs and biotechnology is another really exciting area that, some people spend the rest of their lives in, right? Now, there's lots of different stages that you can also slice these three into. So the first is that there's basic research, right? So some people really like doing research, which is just discovery, right? It's just you're discovering something really new and really cool, and then you kind of hand it off to someone else to translate. The second stage is you can then use that research to actually have some kind of clinical benefit, right? So that is you take someone's research and then you see if it works in humans or not, okay? And a lot of doctors, for example, might operate here. Although some doctors like do find a lot of happiness here as well, like basic research, right? Like they're just finding, new discovery about how the eye works or how the kidney works or kind of really basic stuff. After you have kind of the translational research side, then you're exiting the university and you do a startup. So some doctors really like this, right? Like they love being a startup founder. They like getting VC money, like blah, 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 right? And then the fourth is working in an established company, right? So you might work, for example, at a Medtronic or a Boston Scientific kind of in an established company. So if I'm thinking like which one kind of speaks to you, right? Like, and all of them have kind of different natures and different characters. Yeah, so we kind of usually have this like table where it's like, you just like cross like where you like, right? But yeah, like this is like how we think about in our lab about like how to actually approach medtech. And, lots of different people have completely different ways that they fill out this table, right? So worthwhile thinking about. Another thing that's useful to know as well or be aware of is that there are like parts of medtech which are lower capital and shorter time frame. So it's faster, right? It's just faster to do, right? So for example, like digital health startups usually take about 2 to 5 years before you can find success, right? Medical devices usually take around 7 to 10 years. And then implants, pharmaceuticals or bioengineering usually take around, I would say like 10 to 20 years. Okay, so as you imagine, like someone working in pharma or implants or something, right? Like you're dedicating like a huge chunk of your life into a certain project, right? And some people like that, right? Some people love that. Some people are like, oh, it's too much of a commitment. I'm just going to do this one, right? Because you can find success really quickly, right? So yeah, so just think about like what timeframes, speak to you as well. Okay, So let's discuss through some biodesign basics. So the biodesign methodology was developed at Stanford University almost 27 years ago. And it's a repeatable process for clinical innovation, right? So it was basically a bunch of entrepreneurs who were very successful and they got together and they were like, hey, we're doing the same thing, right? Like we keep on doing the same thing over and over again, right? So why don't we sit down for a few hours, figure out exactly what the common principles are, and then teach this as a course at Stanford, right? And so it was developed as a program to convert like complete amateurs into experts on how to actually bring basically something from research grade right to the bedside. Okay, so kind of very cool stuff. Now their focus was on all sorts of stuff because they recognized that everyone needs to be involved. So they targeted clinicians, they targeted engineers, they targeted like business people as well, who they call operators, right? And yeah, in 25 years, it's been like wildly successful. They've had like 50 successful companies, I think like 10 million lives impacted. Alumni have raised $1.2 billion, which is quite a lot of money. Yeah, and so on, right? So it's quite a cool methodology. And it's quite basic actually. So I went through the kind of course, as an alumni and that kind of thing. And it was more simple than I thought it would be, right? And so there's just a couple of really basic kind of principles that they have. The first is that they break down the process of innovation to 3 stages, right? And you're mostly going to be operating in these 2 here. But this one here is also valuable, but we just don't have enough time really to cover it, right? The first stage is that you need to understand the problem. Okay, that's all. You need to understand the problem. You need to understand it like kind of like the back of your hand. The second is that once you understand the problem very deeply, then you need to brainstorm solutions. Okay, and then find the best one. So a lot of people, I've I've been helping a lot of clinicians here at Monash, right? And people always come to me with the solution first, right? And they literally don't understand the problem, right? Even if they're a clinician in that field, right? Like they just haven't even asked other people, they haven't asked other clinicians or anything like that, right? Like it's just their own opinion, right? And so yeah, so this was like a huge realization for me, which is you actually need to spend like almost like an ungodly amount of time understanding the problem first before you understand enough to build any kind of solution, right? So like we probably spent like 6 to 12 months on just understanding the problem before building a solution. But you guys have about a week or something, so it's no stress, right? Like we don't expect the same grade of problem, and that's fine. And then the third is that once you have a problem and a solution, then the answer is to sit down and figure out a bunch of stuff. And that's going to be things like regulatory strategy. So that is how you're going to get approval from the government. The second thing is how you're going to get paid by the government. Okay, because if you're not going to get paid by the government, no one's going to make money at all, right? Like you can't even sell the damn thing, right? So that's called reimbursement strategy. Another thing is intellectual property, right? If you can't protect your own stuff, how are you going to sell anything, right? Because someone's just going to copy you, right? And then the fourth and final thing is business model, right? How are you actually going to sell it to the hospital? How are you going to make money, right? So those 4 things, and it's really interesting because Stanford's methodology is they don't fund a single dollar until you've figured out everything, right? Because all of this is free. All of this should be free, right? So, and they're very strict about this, right? So you literally like must get the end here and you have to have a solid damn plan before they give you any money whatsoever. And it's the same with VCs in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, or Silicon Valley. I feel like here or in other countries I've seen, if you kind of have this, they kind of give you money. You know what I mean? Like, which I think is a bad thing because it's like it kind of doesn't train people to be rigorous in thinking of these plans, right? So, but you'll be spending mostly time on this in this competition, which is fine. But yeah, like just be aware that there's a lot more to it, right? Like in terms of this. And we'll have a course later if you want to learn a bit more about this process. Now, in terms of how this kind of process works, right? It follows this design methodology called the double diamond, right? Which basically says that when you're dealing with the problem and when you're dealing with the solution, the way that you need to approach it is always that you basically expand the number of problems that you're looking at, and then you pick the best one. And it's the same with the solution. So you expand the number of potential solutions you're looking at, and then you pick the best one. And so a lot of this is brainstorming, right? So kind of like when you open up here, it's all about brainstorming. It's all about like thinking, all right, what are other ways to frame the problem? What are other parts of the problem we haven't looked at? What are other like users we have, like, maybe there's like a type of doctor we've missed about this, right? Or maybe we need to talk about the carer. So it's kind of like you actually spend a lot of time, brainstorming tens or hundreds of problems that you can work on. and then you rigorously figure out the best one to work on. Okay. And it's the same with the solution. So once you have this, you're here and you have a problem, then you brainstorm like tens of different solutions. You talk to every bloody type of engineer there is, right? And see if they can think of all types of cool solutions you can do, right? And then you rigorously select the best one. And so that's a very scientific process if you think about it, right? Because you generate a bunch of hypotheses and then you narrow down. Then you generate again and you narrow down, right? And so by the end, if you've done this right, you will have a very good problem and a very good solution, right? A lot of people kind of just find a problem they like and just immediately go to that one, which is kind of the wrong way to do things. Okay, yeah. So let's jump into unmet clinical needs. So unmet clinical needs are talking about this part here. Okay, so we're just going to focus primarily on this part here today. But then, when you're building the solution, we recommend that you actually think of a broad range of solutions using AI, and then you kind of narrow down and find the best one, okay, before kind of building a demo. Okay, so unmet clinical needs. So this term was kind of invented and is very, very specific and very important. So let's kind of break it down a little bit. So what does unmet mean? So unmet is something that is not currently solved or poorly solved. So you don't want to be working on a problem that is already solved. Okay, that's like a no-brainer. But you'd be surprised because a lot of clinicians will bring to me problems, that are very clearly already solved, right? And I'm like, is it actually unmet? You know what I mean? Like, is it something that's really a problem? This word need here, so if a solution existed, your solution would become essential. Okay, so that is, if you were to invent a solution, everyone would think it's like the best thing since sliced bread kind of thing, right? Like everyone loves the solution. They don't have any other thing that they can use, right? And then clinical is just, more like healthcare. It impacts patients or consumers or clinicians or health services. It impacts medicine or healthcare in some way. Okay, so that's kind of a broader term. Now, there are 4 components for a successful unmet clinical need, okay? And in the competition, we're going to look very carefully at these 4, okay? So you need to understand these 4 very, very well. The first one is the problem. So the problem is the issue from the user's perspective, okay? That is impacting quality or affordability of care in some way, okay? So what that means is that usually there is a user for your device, okay? And they need to have some kind of problem. Now, I'm not talking about the patient. This is usually a doctor, okay, or a nurse, or someone who's having a serious issue at the hospital, okay? So you need to understand the issue from that person's perspective very well. Now, usually clinicians are quite good at this, okay? Because if you're medical students, you spend some time in the hospital, you see things from the doctor's perspective, right? And so therefore you will understand what the doctor's problems are, okay? Now, as engineers, you might find it a little bit more challenging to understand that, right? So that's where you have to either talk to doctors or you have to spend time, observing doctors, right? And almost like being them a little bit, right? Yeah, shadowing them or kind of becoming them, right? But yeah, so this problem is focused primarily on the doctor, okay? What is the doctor's problems or the nurse's problems or the clinician's problem, right? And do you understand it, okay? That's part number 1. The second part is the population. So this is now referring to the patient, okay? So this is the subgroup of patients, that are impacted by this problem, okay? So say, for example, I have, we're talking about some cardiac issue, right? Some heart issue. The population will be the population of patients with that heart issue, okay? While the problem will be something that the cardiologists are running into, right? So we're talking about completely kind of 2 different parties here. The third thing is the payer. So I'm going to start here, the payer, which is who is actually going to pay for this thing, right? And I guarantee it's usually not the doctor, right? Like doctors, they don't take out of their salary money to pay for stuff, right? It's usually the hospital or the government or, maybe like a charity or something, in developing countries, right? Usually in Australia, it's Medicare, right? So that is, the government will pay for it. If it's a clinic thing, then maybe the clinic might pay for it, right? But usually the doctor will never pay out of their own pocket, okay? In some rare circumstances, particularly here, but in developing countries, it's more common, the patient must pay for it themselves, okay? So for example, in many countries, I think like in India, like patients will pay for their own heart catheter, right? Like they will go to the store, buy it before their procedure, and then bring it to the doctor and give them the catheter they want, right? So you have to kind of understand what the payment dynamics are for the country that you're operating in, right? Once you understand the payer, then you need to understand what is important to them. So that is, what is an outcome that they actually care about, Okay. And usually this is like a quantifiable metric. So that is a metric that is not very wishy-washy. It's literal number, okay, that they care about that is compelling to them. Okay, so for, we'll talk about this later, but for hospitals, hospitals usually have KPIs that they care about, and they literally publish this, right? So if, for example, we look at Monash Health KPI, you can just literally find what the, key performance indicators are for the hospital, right? So that is how they're measuring their own performance, right? And you'll see stuff, you can look here. So it's like, 30-day hospital readmission. They want to minimize that, right? They want to decrease the in-hospital mortality rates for stroke and myocardial infarction, right? These are not supposed to be like hidden things, right? They will publish very broadly and actually report how they're going on these, right? And these are the things that they're very happy to pay for because that's how they're judged usually by the government, right? And funding might be tied to this, right? So if a hospital does very poorly, the government might actually decrease their funding, right? And then bring that funding to hospitals that are doing really well for it, right? So this is an example of an outcome that is quantifiable, right? So you see how all of these, none of them are wishy-washy. It's like the rate of sepsis per 1,000 bed days, right? It's very obvious how they're measuring it, right? In a numerical way. And so, for example, if you can improve this, this would be something very great as an outcome, right? And very sellable as a product, okay? Yeah. So those are the four things that represent the unmet need, right? And I'll talk about this later in the competition, but we're going to look very carefully at these four things, right? Because teams that understand this will have a massive, massive edge in terms of building something that actually someone is going to buy. Okay. And this is not easy to get right, as you'll see. Okay. So we'll usually put these four components into what we call a need statement. It's just basically a sentence, right? So it's a nice way to kind of represent it. So a way to describe the problem, for this population in order to do this outcome for a payer. Okay. And so for an example, an example that we have here is a way to improve mobility for stroke patients in order to reduce the cost of rehab for the neurology department. Okay. So see how here I've identified a problem for the doctor. Okay. So the doctors want patients to improve their mobility. This is for stroke patients. The payer is going to be the neurology department in this case, okay? And they want to reduce the cost of rehab because it's a big line item, budget line item for them, okay? So that's how you build a need statement. And you guys will get some experience doing that today. Now, these look deceptively simple, but are surprisingly hard to get right? And usually it's the first point of failure for the majority of innovators, okay? Okay, so I'm going to get you to try it now yourself, right? So say you're on wards, right? And you observe that an anesthetic registrar, so that is someone who's involved with putting a patient to sleep, right, in surgery, struggles to intubate a patient. So that is put this tube down their throat so that they can breathe, right? Leading to a met call, which is an emergency call, okay? So I'd like you to spend just maybe 5 minutes with your partner trying to craft a need statement based on this, okay? So that is identifying what the problem is, what the population is, what the outcome is, and what the pay and who the payer is. Okay? So I'll give you 5 to 10 minutes to try that exercise. All right. So let's see how different people built this, right? Because it's kind of interesting to see what people were thinking about. Outcome and payer. Okay, yeah. So give me your kind of like first need statement.
So our first one was a way to improve intubation equipment
Yeah.
for anesthetics registrars in order to reduce the number of failed intubations.
Reduce number of failed intubations. Yep.
Yeah, for the anesthetics department.
For anesthetics. Okay. Okay, nice. Any other ones?
We then had another one, which was a way to increase supervision of anesthetics registrars.
Yeah, give me a second. Supervision of anesthetic registrars. Yep. Okay.
Yeah. To reduce the amount of time between like a failed and successful intubation.
Amount of time between failed and successful intubation. Yep.
For the anesthetics department.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Okay, any other ones?
Not really. The other outcome we thought was like maybe reducing met calls.
Reducing met calls. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so yeah, what is that here? Reducing met calls.
Germany.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to the next theme. So did you guys think of any different populations, problems, or payers or outcomes?
We had a slightly different
Yeah.
or the problem or so we thought of so the entire sentence was a way to optimize position and techniques for intubation. So like it depends on what angle, like which direction you're putting in the
Yep.
intubation to increase accuracy and the success rate of tube placement for the hospital, specifically the anesthetic departments.
Yeah, for the anesthetic department. You also thought the payer would be the anesthetic department as well?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so the population is for registrars?
We thought patients, but I guess it could be
Yeah, what patients were you thinking?
Maybe like surgery, just any patients who are receiving
Surgical, just any
surgical.
surgical patient or?
If we get really specific, wait.
Yeah.
Should we
So
get
yeah.
that specific though?
Sorry, what was that?
Is it good to get that specific though?
Yeah, surgical patients. Yeah, question
Maybe
mark.
like
Maybe just put that.
I don't know, maybe like pregnancy specifically for
Yeah, okay, interesting. So you're thinking of like pregnant patients, right? Or pregnant patients? Okay, yep. Why did you think of pregnant patients?
because I think in that case, intubation and being anesthetized would be super important.
Yeah, intubation's harder, definitely. Exactly. Yep. Okay, cool. Any other kind of directions you thought about?
No, not really.
Not really?
Main
Okay.
one.
Yeah. Okay, next one. What did you guys think of?
Well, my whole statement was a way to reduce failed or difficult intubations and airway related med calls by at least. I also like looked at KPIs to like give
Yeah.
like rough
Yeah,
percentages.
awesome.
By at least 30% within 12 months. For
By at least
hospital,
by at least 30% within 12 months. Okay, yep.
for hospital surgical patients undergoing general anesthesia,
Yep.
in order to decrease unplanned ICU admissions by 20%, cut post-operative airway-related complications by 25%, and reduce average perioperative length of stay by 0.5 days for public hospitals and hospital health services.
Interesting. Okay. Yep. I like it. Okay, so you kind of went slightly different here, which is I sorry, I didn't write this whole thing here, but
Yeah.
you thought about hospitals paying instead of anesthetic departments paying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you tell us more about that? Like, why do you think hospitals are more likely to pay for something like this than
Because
anesthetic departments?
like these med calls and then ultimately like resulting in these ICU admissions and
Yeah.
just a longer
Yeah.
length of stay
Yeah.
is ultimately the biggest like cost for hospitals.
Yeah.
So I feel like they'll be more willing to
Yeah.
ultimately cut this at the forefront.
Yeah, that's a really good realization, which is when you fail and you have a med call, and if, for example, you go to ICU, then it's not the anesthetic department that's paying for it, right? It's the whole hospital that has to pay for it, right? So you have to kind of find a payer who's incentivized to fix a problem if it's impacting other departments, right? So really good thoughts there. Okay, awesome. What about you guys?
So we came up with a way to reduce hypoxia
Reduce hypoxia. Okay, nice. Yep.
for patients under general anesthesia
Okay.
in order to decrease brain damage and organ failure
Okay.
for hospitals because hospitals could get sued.
Okay. So more for litigation. So it's maybe this is more like to reduce litigation from brain damage. Is that right? Like
Yeah, and organ
okay.
failure.
Yeah. An organ failure. Okay. Yep. Cool. All right. Last team. Oh yeah. Oh, yourself as well.
I think one of ours was a way to improve airway visualization during first pass intubation attempts in obese surgical patients.
During first pass intubation attempt. Is that right?
Yes.
Yep.
In obese surgical patients.
Yes.
For anesthetic registrars, in order to reduce peri-induction hypoxia and prevent MET or MET escalations in the operating theater for the
Yep. Sorry, could you repeat that last
wait, sorry,
Yeah.
I kind of stumbled on my words. So I think it was the problem was to improve airway visualization during first pass intubation attempts in obese surgical patients for anesthetic registrars in order to reduce peri-induction hypoxia and prevent MET escalations in the operating theater. And then our payer, I had thought like the anesthetic department, but I guess
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. We'll give you some time to refine it, right? So I think like one of the best ways that I found to kind of teach this stuff, right, is to kind of run through each one and kind of give feedback on how you can improve it, right? So let's take a look at what we have, right? So the first thing is let's take a look at, all the kind of potential directions that people went in, right? So the first thing is that even though we have the same stem, right? So that is, we have this stem here, an anesthetic registrar struggles to intubate a patient, leading to a met call. We can see how broad the different problems and populations and outcomes and payers that people identified were, right? Which is kind of really interesting, right? Because you all kind of have received roughly the same training, right? But you see different problems based on a single observation or the same observation, right? And as you can imagine, if you spend a whole day in the hospital, you're going to see probably like hundreds of different problems and kind of frame each problem differently as well, okay? Now, there's a couple of kind of best practices to help this, right? So the first is checking whether the problem is something that is being faced by the user, right? So that is a clinical user, right? So for example, so let's take a look at these and see if there's any. Okay, so this one here is good in terms of reaching with the clinical user, right? But this one, usually, we prefer having a single key problem that you're solving for, right? Now, these are related problems, right? So, if you're trying to solve this and this at the same time, like you will improve both simultaneously, right? But, Biodesign kind of forces you to refine and really figure out what exactly the problem is. Do people care more about this or do people care more about this, right? And it kind of tells you a bit about the culture of the hospital, right? If, for example, a hospital is really into decreasing the number of met calls, and there's a couple of hospitals in Australia that are very, they're very strict on decreasing met calls, right? They will care very much about this, right? While a hospital that really worries about, for example, like education or kind of making sure that the patient experience is right, might care a lot more about this. Okay, and so that's where you kind of really have to dig down into what exactly that hospital really cares about, or the users really care about, or what the culture a little bit is in that hospital, right? But yeah, so this one here, I think supervision of anesthetic registrars. So this one's interesting as well, right? So this is more educational, right? So it's kind of interesting to see how these ones here are quite clinical, right? These ones here, like this one and this one and this one, kind of speak to me about equipment, right? As in, like, there is something wrong with the equipment that we have, or there is something wrong with the supervision of these registrars, right? It's a lot more educational, right? So it's kind of interesting to see that, and I'm glad to see that, like, someone thought of education, someone thought of equipment, someone thought of how you might do better for difficult patients, right? So it could be that the patient themselves were difficult, right? Like, for example, I'm sure you've seen the Mallampati score before, right? So some patients inherently are just more difficult to intubate, right? Because of obesity or pregnancy or whatever it is, right? And so it might not actually be a reason of the skill of the anesthetic registrar, but rather it's just a particularly difficult to intubate patient, right? So this is where you kind of, at that point in time, have to ask questions, right? Like, which is, is it just this anesthetic registrar that's having issues? Is it other registrars would have difficulty with the same patient? Is it the patient that's making things really difficult, or is it the fact that a proper consultant, consultants already trained, would still have challenges with this, right? Would a resident have troubles with this, right? Why was the met call cold, right? I think someone assumed that it was hypoxia, right? But we have no idea if it was hypoxia that led to this met call or not, right? Where there's no kind of further information about that. And there's lots of reasons why a met call might be cold. It could be that the heart rate's high, could be, like they have a fever or something. So it's like all sorts of other stuff that could lead to a met call as well, right? Yeah, so in terms of kind of identifying the problem, right? You have to kind of ask these hard questions and really think about, like, what exactly it is that they're trying to work on, like the clinical user has a problem for. Now, in terms of the population, it's kind of interesting to see the diversity of the population we have here. So some people were thinking along the lines of the anesthetic registrar, right? So that is, the population is for the clinician. Now, keep in mind that usually we do prefer that this population is for a subset of patients, okay? Unless you're explicitly improving something just for the registrar themselves, right? Because, if you develop a solution, it might be for other doctors too. It might be for junior doctors. It might be for more senior doctors as well, right? So that's why usually this population will refer to a patient population, okay? Now, in terms of patient populations, it's really cool to see the kind of, how people were thinking. We have surgical patients, which is quite broad. We have surgical patients who are undergoing general anesthesia, which narrows it down, as you can see, right? It's a smaller subset. then we have even smaller subsets, like for example, like obese surgical patients or pregnant patients. And I'll kind of teach you a way to think about scoping the population. But generally, you almost want a small population where you can solve the problem, right? But obviously, this needs to be somewhat informed. Okay, so that is, you need to know, for example, that you should look up the stats, like how many pregnant patients have a med call from failed intubation, right? How many obese patients have a failed med call from from a failed med call from a failed intubation, right? So this is where you can ask people. If you can't ask people because the time is too tight, then you can look up research, right? So it's like, I'm sure there's research where people will say, if your BMI is above 30 or 35, your intubation failure rate just like skyrockets, right? Because it's just so hard to kind of shove something down, right? And I wonder for pregnancy, I actually don't know what the rate of pregnancy, failed intubation in pregnant patients is, right? So yeah, so you need to kind of think carefully about this and ask kind of the hard questions in terms of like, even in obese patients, how can you break that down further? Is it because is it a certain BMI? So for example, is it like BMI 35 plus is when issues start cropping up? Or is it like BMI 30, right? What if they're like on Ozempic? For some reason, if they're on Ozempic, does it make intubation easier despite the BMI not really increasing or decreasing? Or is it obese surgical patients who have sleep apnea, right? So they have kind of issues that are already known to be causing kind of a constriction of their airway, right? So lots of different questions that you can ask. Now, in terms of the payer, so we'll talk about the payer first. So the main kind of payers here to consider is the anesthetic department if they care about it, right? So a big question is, say for example, our outcome is to reduce med calls. Maybe the anesthetic department doesn't even have a KPI about that. You don't know, right? Like this is where you need to find out, right? And I'm sure there's some studies about anesthetic department KPIs, right? That you can just search online. You don't even need to go and ask them. Usually these departments will publish stuff online as well. Okay. And yeah, sorry, yeah.
So how often so the KPI tells you where we'd like to go.
Yes.
So where would you be able to see how much it's costing them, like the loss at the moment?
Yeah, in terms of how much it's costing them, it has to be a bit of an estimate, unfortunately, right? Unless you can ask them for data, like which you can sometimes, but some hospitals are not comfortable sharing that data. Now, in terms of these KPIs, they do share how they're going, though, right? So they'll be like, oh, for met calls, we had like a 2% met call rate or something, right? So they will publish that, and we're hoping to get down to like 1% kind of thing, right? Like that's how they'll say it, but they won't say how much it costs them because it can be very hard to cost it, as you can imagine, right? Like what do you include in the cost, right? Is it like the wasted life or something of someone, or like, do you count that, for example, or is it just pure like staff time or something, right? Like, so they will never cost it, right? But you can kind of roughly guess, right? Based on a clinical understanding, like, if someone goes to the ICU, like that's a huge cost to the hospital, for example, right? But you can get rough numbers, but you can't get precisely how much it costs. Yeah.
And the rough numbers are good enough to kind of...
Yeah, to have an estimate as to the scale of how important this thing is, right? So it's just order of magnitude rather than precise numbers. Yeah.
I'm seeing a lot of like KPIs. They seem to be, at least from the way we've been talking about
Yeah.
now, it seems to be more relevant to like hospitals and dealing with like
Yeah.
surgical procedures. and
Yes.
stuff. So in the interest of more dealing with things like prevention and more of like a GP based
Yeah.
system,
Yeah.
how do KPIs, obviously like building a product, it looks really good to be able to address KPIs.
Yeah.
But is that same level of infrastructure, like of KPIs equivalent, available for that kind of prevention and on a GP level?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the first kind of tragedy of the modern healthcare system is that you don't really get paid for preventative healthcare, right? So some systems do this better than others, right? So, I think some Scandinavian countries are really, really good at paying for preventative healthcare, right? So as in like, GPs will get paid like a decent amount if they are doing preventative activities, right? In Australia and more so in America, especially in America, you don't get paid anything for preventative activities, right? So it's like if you do a procedure, you will get paid a lot of money, right? If you do like, you see a patient for heart failure, you will get a lot of money, right? But if you try and prevent the heart failure from happening at all, then you don't get any money whatsoever, right? So because of that, people are more likely to kind of just wait for, things to happen and then kind of react to it, right? Because they're going to get paid a lot more kind of at scale, right? compared to preventing people at scale. Now, that being said, there are some parties to some payers who have an incentive for that, right? Usually it's not at the hospital level, it's not at the clinic level, it's at the government level, right? So the government, because they are in charge of all the budget of healthcare anyway, right? They are incentivized to decrease, disease in the future, right? Because it saves them money in the long term, right? But again, keeping in mind that political cycles are like 3 to 4 years, right? And some of these diseases take like 20 years to manifest. Do you know what I mean? So, right? Like, unless it's like politically important in some way. So for example, like skin cancer in Australia, usually you don't see hospitals massively getting into preventative healthcare either, just like a general baseline that they have, but not like ramping it up constantly kind of thing, right? Yeah.
Okay. And then the follow-up to that is, say if you wanted to build something around preventative healthcare,
Yeah.
because I think there's still a really big role in that.
Yeah.
Then how would you go to try
Yeah.
and make a product out of it?
Great question. So the payers that you have access to is one, the government, if the government finds it important for some reason, right? So that is, it's recently been in the news, or there's been some scandal, or we call it the Overton window, which is the window of which, public politics thinks about, right? So if it's particularly near or in the Overton window, then usually it's very, you can get some funding from the government or from state governments or, charities or NGOs, that kind of stuff, right? But if it's outside of that window, then it can be very, very challenging to get funding because no one's going to fund. Like, no, it's not top of mind for anyone, right? In which case you might have to rely, for example, on NGOs or charities, or you might have to rely on the patient paying themselves, right? Like I'm sure you've seen like the companies where you can do full body scans to make sure that you don't have cancer, that kind of thing, right?
Yep.
Patients are paying for that, not, do you know what I mean? Like not governments, not hospitals, nothing like that, right? So patients out of their own accord, right, some patients want to pay for that, right? So that's like one way to approach it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Professor, I have a question about the problems we're talking. So I want to find a way to how to define the word problem, because I was thinking in this practice, I was thinking so different way that cause this problem and what is the reason to cause this problem, and I will think of that way. And the other hand was the problem is in terms of in other terms of the needs of clinical. So can I have a better definition of how we think about what we are really looking for the problems part? Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely on the right track in terms of, you need to think very carefully about what the problem is, right? And what the definition of the problem is, and, what the scope of the problem is as well. Like, are you tackling, like you can look at this simple observation sentence in like many, many ways, right? And, there's just so many potential angles of attack a little bit, right? This is why you need to, not even come up with one need statement, but actually almost come up with 5 or 10, right? For this, like looking from different angles, how could you construe this as a problem, right? And so, so then then you discuss with your team and you're like, okay, like this one makes the most sense, right? The way that we framed it. But yeah, like obviously a challenge is making sure that the problem you have, the population you have, the outcome you have, and the pay you have are all kind of coherent in some way, right? Like it's a problem that, clinician, you know clearly what the clinician is, you know clearly what the patient population is, you know clearly who the payer might be, as well as what outcome they're interested in, right? And you can see how parties that we missed here, like we didn't think about Medicare, right? Like, is there something where Medicare might actually pay for, right? Like the government themselves. Clinics aren't appropriate for this one. I don't know if patients probably wouldn't pay for anything, right? Because people are used to getting intubated without cost, right? But that's in Australia, right? Like in other countries, it could be that the government plays a bigger role, or the government plays a lesser role, or patients might play a bigger role. In terms of outcomes, so I really liked, like this one here, right? Like where you were kind of thinking about percentages and like what actually moves the needle, right? For, because if you just say like, oh, like reducing met calls, like by how much, right? Like by how much is important for the hospital, right? Like how much so that they would actually pay for it, right? Because I presume if, you reduce met calls by 1%, no one cares, right? But if you're reducing met calls by like 10%, that is a huge difference. If you're reducing met calls by 100%, they'll pay anything for it kind of thing, right? So like understanding like at what point the needle is moved is also really important as well, right? And you can kind of derive that a little bit from looking at the KPIs, right? Like what their goals are, right? If their goal is to halve it, then that's what they're expecting from you, right? If their goal is to decrease by 10%, that's what they're expecting from you, right? That is what they consider to be moving the needle, right? So this kind of stuff is like surprisingly more valuable than you expect, right? Like it's just they publish their goals. Like hospitals are quite transparent about that. Departments are less likely to be as transparent, but usually if there's a related KPI that's like specifically for them at a hospital level, it will be like they will be in charge of that KPI, right? So there's ones that are like whole of hospital, for example, like available beds, like it's kind of diffused, right? Like it's no specific department that's in charge of that. But if it's like, Met calls, for example, like the Met team is usually responsible for that in some way, right? Yeah. This one here was kind of interesting, right? Like litigation from brain damage and organ failure. Usually in the United States, they will care a lot about this because it's a very litigative society, right? So like then lawsuits will happen. I think outside of America, usually litigation isn't a massive, massive consideration for hospitals, right? Because they do get sued, but it's kind of rare, right? Like, and it's kind of rare and they usually have insurance and that kind of thing. So they don't really take the brunt of the force of it, you know what I mean? Like, so they're less likely to pay for something just to merely reduce litigation unless it's in the Overton window. So for example, like, they had a recent death that was very high profile from it and all the politicians are breathing down the neck of the hospital, right? And so they're very stressed about it and therefore want to find a solution, right? But kind of in the absence of that, like usually hospitals aren't motivated by litigation that much. Again, with this one here, so we have like two, right? Like reduce peri-induction hypoxia and prevent MET escalations. Biodesign teaches that you should have just one, right? Because you need to know which one is the most important for the payer, right? And usually there is one that is clearly important, right? So, this one here, I would imagine is much more important than this one because this is really hard to measure, right? It's really hard to quantify for a hospital. While this one, it's like, yeah, like, the MET call has happened and it's going to be logged and someone is going to know exactly how many MET calls there are, right? And that's going to be a KPI, okay? All right, awesome. So, yeah, so as you can see, like there's a lot that you can basically break down with this, right? And so we'll go through now a couple of ways that you can actually break down the need statement in kind of a more detailed way, right? Okay, so let's go through each kind of part one by one. So in this sentence, the very first thing we tackle is the problem, right? And so kind of just, kind of nailing the point home, right? So the problem is the problem from a user's perspective, right? And this user usually is a clinician, okay? So someone who's like clinically involved at the hospital. And they will usually have a direct exposure to the problem and will also administer the solution. So they're going to be the ones holding the solution literally and then like doing something to the patient, okay? Usually this is the doctor or nurse and not the patient. And there's a couple of strategies that you can do to figure out more about the problem, okay? So the first one is to dig deeper and ask many questions. So like that, like that vignette, right? There's many questions you can ask. But then there's also a bunch of scoping activities that you can think about as well to brainstorm new problems, okay? So the first one is known as problem scoping. Problem scoping basically means that we think about the lower, kind of like a smaller version of the problem and a larger version of the problem, and then a parallel version of the problem, right? So just go for an example what that means. So say we identify the problem is to reduce falls from those with poor vision, okay? So that is you have poor vision and you fall. A smaller version of that would be to reduce falls specifically from cataracts, okay? So cataracts is a subset of poor vision, okay? A larger version of that would be to reduce falls, so any kind of falls, okay? So falls from anything. And then a parallel version might be to reduce falls from age-related macular degeneration. Okay, so you see how it's kind of parallel in size to poor vision, okay? Or actually, it would be parallel in size to cataracts, right? Another kind of parallel one here would be to reduce falls from slipping on the ground or like incontinence or something like that, something much broader, okay? So you see how you can actually select the scope of problem that you're tackling, okay? So for example, if we go back to this list here, a broader version of this, right? So say we have improved intubation equipment. A broader version would be just to improve anesthetic equipment. You see how it's a superset of what we were describing there. A more specific version would be improve, let's say, like, a specific intubation equipment. I actually don't know what the intubation equipments are called, right? But like specifically this brand's intubation equipment that the hospital uses, or this type of intubation equipment, okay? Or intubation equipment under these specific circumstances, only in this circumstance. A kind of parallel thing might be to improve visualization of the airway, okay? So it's like a parallel step, right? Which might also contribute to the failure, but is a distinctly different step, okay? So problem scoping is a very powerful way in order to kind of think of different ways that you can frame the problem, okay? And usually you want to go broader, narrower, and parallel, okay? Just to see what feels right, okay? And usually at some point, something will feel right. If you kind of just keep on going narrow or keep on going broader, you eventually get a feel for what kind of the scope of the problem is. Okay, next is journey scoping. So this is when you map out the patient journey throughout the clinical event that you're describing, okay? So for example, it could be, the patient is being intubated. What happens to the patient before intubation and what happens afterwards? You should map it out kind of as a series of events, right? So if we go back, for example, to the patient falls example that we were just talking about, right? We can actually map out what happens when a patient falls, right? Or what happens before and after. So say a patient develops visual issues, this visual issue will then worsen over time. And then it leads to the patient falling, okay? And then the patient's admitted to the hospital and then they're discharged, okay? In another kind of set of circumstances, maybe the patient develops visual issues, then they're recognized by a family member and then the visual issue is solved, right? So you can see how you can tackle different parts of the patient journey, right? So if we're fixing just the fact that they're falling, we kind of miss out on this early part here. So it's like, what if instead we fix this part here? So like they never develop visual issues and therefore never have a fall, okay? Or we kind of decide that the problem is later. So that is, they're admitted to the hospital after a fall and the quality of care is not great there. So we want to fix an issue there, right? So you can see how with the patient journey, you can kind of map out this journey and then tackle different parts of it, right? So, if we go back to our example here, it could be that, we prevent obesity so that they are not obese and therefore don't have issues with ventilation, right? Like that's tackling it way early in the process, right? Or it could be that, before they go under general anesthesia, their risk is identified, right? And so you get like an expert anesthetic consultant to do it instead of a registrar, right? So a lot earlier in the process, you're identifying the problem. Or it could be that, after they have a MET call, you have a better way to treat what has already happened, right? So again, there's like a whole patient journey and you can think carefully about different parts of the journey you want to kind of tackle. Okay, next one is user scoping. So this is thinking about who else is involved in the patient's care, right? So we focus primarily on the anesthetic registrar, but you should be thinking about things like the consultant, the resident, the intern, right? The nurses, maybe there's an anesthetic nurse who can solve this instead, right? Or maybe there's a carer who can solve this instead. So, you want to think broadly about different specialty or training levels, right? I think that's very natural for, us clinicians to think about. There's a hierarchy and you can go up or down the hierarchy. You can think about different clinical interests. So maybe it's not the anesthetic registrar you should be thinking about. Maybe it's the ICU physician you need to be thinking about, or the GP, or whatever it is, right? Think about different facilities. So obviously less appropriate for this, although still appropriate, which is, maybe we're not even talking about a major hospital at this point. We're seeing this in a rural hospital, right? Where there's a lot less capacity, right? And so that leads to a whole host of different issues, right? Rather than a major hospital like Alfred. Think about their carers and their family, whether they can help out, right? Or whether there's some kind of like demographic or socioeconomic focus. What if we saw this in a hospital that is in an area of low socioeconomic status, right? Like this might be different to a much wealthier area, right? And we have to understand why, right? So that's kind of expanding your mind about, how you can think about the user. Okay, so any questions before we move on to the population? Okay, so for the population, this is the patient population with a specific unmet clinical need, right? So you can break this down into many, many different ways, right? So for example, say we have, obese surgical patients, right? The ways that you can break it down is things like geography. So it could be that, patients of a certain state have this problem, or patients of a certain country have this problem, or patients of a certain city or hospital have this problem, right? You can break it down by demographics. So it could be you realize that, people over the age of 50 keep on having failed intubations at this hospital. I don't know why, right? Or it's usually kids who keep on having issues, right? You can consider gender, like it could be pregnant patients are having issues, or, males of above a certain age or something. Think about socioeconomic status if you feel it's appropriate, right? Like, does wealth really impact this? Think about clinical risk factors. So for example, we had obesity as a clinical risk factor, right? We had pregnancy as a risk factor, right? We maybe, genetically, they're predisposed to having intubation issues, right? Attitude towards healthcare providers. There's a lot of people who don't trust the healthcare system, right? So maybe there's some kind of population whereby you want to treat those who, have a strongly negative attitude towards healthcare providers for some reason, right? Existing treatments, maybe they've previously been treated with X and X, right? So maybe they've, previously had intubation, which has failed, right? And so therefore you can identify these people because they previously have had a failed intubation, right? And so they're more likely to have another failed intubation. Access to technology in healthcare, right? So, some rural populations don't have access to the greatest and best care that we have in the cities, right? So think kind of broadly about how you can break up the population. Now, a rule of thumb that we usually have is a smaller population, so that a narrower one is usually better, right? Because if you're suggesting, for example, that you can solve this problem for all obese surgical patients, it might be very challenging, right? But if, for example, you say it's obese surgical patients with sleep apnea and with these qualifiers and that qualifier, it becomes more of a sure thing that you can solve the problem for them, right? Now, you don't want to just kind of narrow it down randomly, right? You have to be very specific about how you're narrowing it down, right? There has to be a reason why you chose obese patients or pregnant patients, right? There has to be some kind of rationale behind it. Yeah. Absolutely. But so the usual rule is that they're called a beachhead, right? You want to find they're called a beachhead. Beachhead? Yeah. So it's like you're finding new land and then you find like a beachhead and then like it is like, the start of Australia or something. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. So it's like you want to find like a piece of solid land that you can stand on, right? And then once you solve the problem for that kind of population, then you start solving it for other related populations, right? And part of the reason why companies actually have to do that is that when you get regulatory approval, they like it when it's narrower, right? Because if it's a very broad population, right, then that you have to make sure it's safe for that entire population, right? So they like if it's narrow and then you kind of expand outwards, right? So usually they recommend actually just err on the side of smaller, right? If you can do larger, someone will tell you along the way, right? But kind of err on a smaller population and then make sure that you can solve it for that population first, yeah. Okay, population scoping. So very similarly to problem scoping, you want an initial population, you want to look at what broader feels like, what narrow feels like, and then what the parallel population feels like, right? So, say we have elderly adults with dementia. The broader version would be elderly adults just entirely, right? A more specific version would be elderly adults with specifically Alzheimer's disease. And then a kind of parallel population would be elderly adults at risk of falls, okay? And so kind of how you do these exercises is that you come up with an initial need statement, and then you just kind of go through each one step by step, right? You just go through the problem, you try scoping, you try like problem scoping, and then you try journey scoping, and then you just see like what feels right. And then you go to the patient population, like for example here, and then you just go like one level like broader, one level narrower, just see if it feels right, one level parallel, see if anything kind of is different. And then you just go through each one. Okay, the payer. So the payer depends on the setting of care of the problem very heavily, right? As you can imagine, if you have an intubation thing, there's no way in how a clinic is going to pay for it, right? Like it has to be the hospital or higher, right? So if it is hospital related, then the kind of people that you want to think about or talk to, right, is people like the head of department, the head of the anesthetic department. They're in charge of a big budget, right? And so they're always thinking about money a little bit, right? Or how they can improve their KPIs. You want to talk to, if it's a big hospital purchase, then you can consider the procurement team. So this is the team at a hospital that is in charge of purchasing, okay? So they're the ones who will make purchasing decisions, right? They decide whether to buy this or to sell this or whatever it is. Then the other one is hospital admin, right? So this is more at the exec level. They, again, usually think from a financial or KPI perspective. Okay, so those are the two most powerful outcomes for payers, which is you're going to make them more money, or you're going to save them expenses, or you're going to improve a key performance indicator. Okay, those are kind of the two most powerful outcomes we want to see. Now, if your problem is at a clinic, so say you want to solve a problem that is clearly at a clinic level, like a GP clinic or, inpatient clinic or whatever it is, right? Then usually you want to talk to the practice manager or head clinician, right? And how they work is a little bit more financial motivated, right? So usually it's like you're increasing money for them or you're decreasing expenses, okay? So clinics usually operate for kind of a profit basis, okay? They're less likely to have KPIs unless it's hospital related. Okay, so that is they're a hospital department. Maybe they might have a KPI, but if it's like a GP clinic, they don't really have KPIs except for seeing more patients, that kind of thing, right? So they're a lot more kind of financial and volume like kind of incentivized, right? All right, in terms of government, so usually you want to talk to a specific team. Now, like I said, the government can be a little bit fickle, right? So it depends whether it's the issue you're tackling is in the Overton window, like I said. So if it is, then you might be able to get some funding for it. If it's not, usually it's very difficult to get funding. Okay, so so the government is kind of its own special thing, and some people really rely on the government. So for example, like things like skin cancer, that kind of thing, right? But outside of that, not really, right? Like unless you're tackling skin cancer, you really can't, at least in Australia, you can't rely on the government that much. Okay, for insurers. So this is in Australia, things like Medicare, if it's like a public insurer, or Medibank, if it's private, right? So how these kind of guys work is for insurers, so public insurance is insurance that is funded by the government, okay? Private is usually funded by the members, right? I don't know if you guys have private insurance, but you have to pay something every month, every 2 weeks or something to be able to get care. In some countries as well, there's a huge non-government organization presence, right? So this is things like Médecins Sans Frontières, or like Doctors Without Borders, or Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So those are all NGOs, right? And they usually are in developing countries, right? So they don't really have a presence in Australia, for example, right? Now, with the public insurers, usually what they care about is whether they're spending the public's money well. Okay, like effectively, right? So what they're looking for usually is cost-effective ways to treat certain diseases, right? Like that is they're not spending a huge amount of money to treat a certain disease because they have to look at a population level, right? If they're too inefficient at the kind of government level, then they'll just simply run out of money, right? So that's kind of like one of their key motivators. For private insurers, it's about revenue, okay? So it's about can they save money or make more money, okay? And then for NGOs, usually it's a mission. Okay, so NGOs, there's lots of NGOs, all of them have completely separate missions. It's all about, are you meeting their mission or not? Okay. All right, and then finally, out of pocket. And this is becoming a little bit larger in Australia, right? But yeah, like patients and carers will pay for things, like you have to pay a gap fee now to see a GP, right? You have to buy some medicines, right? So it's like, it's becoming a little bit more, I guess, like important that, you also consider like what patients want, right? Particularly if they have a choice. For something like an intubation, they don't really have a choice, right? Like they kind of just get intubated. But, if it's like something that, might be a problem at home or, it's an NDIS thing or that kind of thing, right? Like they have more choice about what they're selecting from the market, okay? Okay, so let's talk about the outcome. So the outcome, like I said before, is a quantifiable metric that is compelling to the payer, right? So quantifiable means that it is an outcome that can be measured and tracked, okay? If you take a look at all these KPIs from hospitals, they're all numerical, right? They all can be easily tracked. It's not like going to take them years to try and put the data together to track it, right? It's something that they've already embedded heavily into the system. It's compelling, so that is it's highly visible. So that is everyone knows what the met call rate is, right? Or everyone knows what the sepsis rate is in the hospital, that kind of thing. And it's widely accepted, right? So that is there is good scientific backing about that being an important measure of a quality of a hospital, for example, right? Like if you get a lot of sepsis or you get a lot of death in a hospital, you don't really want to go to that hospital, for example, right? The best method usually to figure out the outcome is just to ask the payer, right? And sometimes it's just available online, right? Like hospitals will publish KPIs, that kind of stuff. So you just kind of know where to look. If it's about patients, then you can simply ask a patient, say it's a patient who has a mental health disease or something. You can ask them what they'd actually be willing to pay for, right? And what they kind of care about. Okay, yeah. And so yeah, like this is a kind of really important slide in figuring out the outcome, right? So for hospitals, it's like KPIs, right? You can just look it up. For clinics, like I said, it's kind of about money or reducing cancellations or kind of increasing volume, right? For the government, it depends on their own KPIs. They sometimes have specific KPIs. Usually it's related to, wait times and bed availability, that kind of stuff that you might hear politicians talk about. And yeah, and for patients, what do they actually want? Usually it's much more personal, right? It's stuff that you can relate to. It's like, do you feel better? Have you saved time? Did you get like respect, like in talking to this clinician, right? Yeah, so very kind of personal stuff. Okay, so exercise 3 is I'm going to give you, say, about 10, 15 minutes, and I want you to work together kind of in your teams to brainstorm 10 or 20 unmet needs in this vignette, right? So you can use this QR code. The next activity is then you're going to work to refine one of your favorite unmet needs, okay? I just want to see you practice refining an unmet need because that's going to be mostly what you're going to be doing in the competition, right? So brainstorming and then refining. Okay, so I'll give you some time to work on that. Okay, so let's talk through some of the common pitfalls that you might kind of see, right? So this is kind of funny, but we always see this. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to develop state a solution in your problem. Okay, so it's like a way to develop a coronary stent. Okay, you never want to kind of specify a solution from the onset of the problem, right? Because it constrains what kind of solutions you might work on. You can sometimes run into this issue where you have the same problem and the same outcome. Okay, so a way to reduce falls in the elderly to reduce falls. Okay, usually what that means is that the clinician, you haven't thought enough about what the clinician wants in this one and what the payer wants in this one. And usually they're never the same thing. Okay, so I've never seen this before. Usually it's because you haven't kind of pulled apart the thread as carefully. Another one is you never want to have old technology, right, in your problem statement. So, for example, a way to improve the speed of fax machines, right? You need to kind of throw out fax machines and go, what if we don't have fax machines? How would we improve the speed of something, right? So it kind of limits emerging approaches. And then you also don't want to have a negative in your problem, okay? So a way to not have infections from dialysis. It could be like a way to reduce infections from dialysis, okay? That's kind of how you'd frame that. All right, if you're interested and want to learn more, we have a great online module actually, if you want to kind of really learn a lot more about how to do Biodesign. And so, yeah, you can just kind of Google this and learn more about how to kind of do unmet clinical needs and what to think about.